price of wisdom. I would not have expected you to be so involved in that sword scholar nonsense, Haina. Piotr stood in the doorway with his arms folded, a severe expression on his face. The woman he was speaking to refused to look up, intent as she was on fixing the tear in the apron. She pushed her needle through the garment and smiled slightly to herself before replying. I don't think I've ever actually met a sword scholar. She paused for a moment as if to contemplate the idea, and then continued. I doubt I ever will, really. So why give Yavi such a hard time? He looked like he'd been mauled by a wolf by the time you finished. The wise test what they know, Piotr. She spoke mildly, but there was granite beneath her words. Like a squirrel looking for nuts hidden under the snow. You have to find the right question. You made him look like a fool, Haina. Why do you do that? He said the Synod sent him. Is there going to be trouble? The people of the Vale knew better than to argue with silver-tongued Haina, but Piotr was worried. She was a wise one, even if she wasn't that old. But she'd embarrassed the beloved old storyteller in the taproom of his inn, and he felt he had a right to know why. Haina put her needlework down and looked up at him. She considered an apology. She knew he and the storyteller were friends, and she'd made Yavi stammer in front of people who looked up to him. But she realized she didn't feel the slightest bit sorry, so she gave him a firm look instead. Test what you've learned, Piotr. Only fools accept hearsay as truth. That's what the way teaches. What it doesn't teach is test what you've learned unless someone important says otherwise. What it doesn't say is you have to find the right question unless the Synod sent them, in which case, just let it go. He took a deep breath, ready to ask another question, but Haina's look turned frosty and she held up a finger. No, Piotr, I'm not arguing right now. I need to finish this stitching before the candle burns down. If you still have questions, well, that's very good. Everyone should be a bulging sack of questions. But you can come back in the morning and we'll talk about it properly. But make sure they're better questions than the ones you've offered up so far. Give some thought as to what it actually is you're asking me, or we're not going to get very far. It looked for a moment as if Piotr might continue to argue, but she kept her gaze steady, and after an awkward moment or two he nodded his head once, muttered a good night, and closed the door. Haina spent a minute or two staring at the door, lost in thought, before remembering that the candle was burning away while she pondered. Mocking herself with a half-smile and a shake of her head, she turned back to her sewing. Overview. Due to the actions of the Wisdom Assembly and the Urazen National Assembly, Synod mandates require greater majorities before they can be enacted successfully. After the autumn equinox, several mandates that had been upheld failed to be enacted. You can learn a bit more about the background to this situation in the further reading section below. One of the key powers of the Imperial Synod is the ability to enact mandates. Arising from statements of principle, a mandate allows the Synod to influence the hearts and minds of the virtuous, and thus guide the Empire. After the autumn equinox, several mandates from the Imperial Synod that were enacted still failed to find purchase in the hearts and souls of Imperial citizens. The priests charged with enacting them were stymied at every turn by the virtuous themselves, querying the wisdom of their mandate and challenging them to complex debates. The named priests and their supporters did nothing wrong, but they could not move the virtuous while dealing with these challenges. The General Assembly has laid blame for this state of affairs squarely at the doors of the sword scholars. While it is true that the heirs of Suleiman are enthusiastically questioning the legitimacy of the Synod's mandates, their influence is largely confined to Urazen. Everywhere else, the questioning is coming from another quarter. It is the Wisdom Assembly that sent Ghislaine Netherwatch to encourage the virtuous to question what they were told. The sword scholars helped to block the Synod's wishes in Urazen, but it is the Wisdom Assembly that is responsible for the wider failure of the autumn mandates throughout the Empire. If the status quo is maintained, nothing will change. all Synod mandates will require a greater majority before they're enacted. Any that do not receive a greater majority simply fail. No liao will be lost, no impact will be felt. Mandates are a transitory thing. There is almost invariably only one chance to enact them. If they fail due to the opposition of the followers of wisdom, then the opportunity is gone. The influence of the Wisdom Assembly should mean that all these mandates need to be upheld with a greater majority to be enacted. However, thanks to the spiritual pilgrimage called for during the autumn equinox for this season only, mandates only need a simple majority to be enacted. The General Assembly. The Sword Scholars bear the brunt of the Synod's ire, but it was the mandate by the Wisdom Assembly that provoked the challenges to the Imperial Synod. To resolve the current situation, the General Assembly could condemn Suleiman Itazil, overrule the Wisdom Assembly, or both. At the moment, no Synod mandate will be enacted unless it is upheld with a greater majority. While the Sword Scholars are invoked as being the cause, their influence outside of Urazen is small. The words of the Wisdom Assembly, by comparison, move people across the entire empire, both those devoted specifically to wisdom and those pilgrims dedicated to the way, are actively challenging priests who attempt to spread the word of mandates that do not provably have the backing of their assembly. To change the situation, the General Assembly would need to identify whether it is the inspiration of Suleiman or the call to arms of the Wisdom Assembly that is the root of the problem. Ruthless, indiscriminate, murderous. The General Assembly could enact a mandate that condemns Suleiman Itazil and her teachings. If enacted, this would resolve the current situation outside Urazen, but have serious implications for Urazen and the General Assembly itself. Rafael Barroso de Tosato's description of the founder of the Sword Scholars leaves little to the imagination. He described her as someone who taught them to browbeat, silence, and murder anyone who raised a dissenting voice, and who would rather strike down a soul seeking the right question than face an unwelcome truth. He urged the virtuous stand against such narrow-minded and dogmatic behaviour. By supporting this statement with a greater majority, it seems as if the General Assembly of the Synod considers the first sword scholar to lack virtue, and those who look to her for inspiration are wrong to do so. The General Assembly could take a deep breath, agree with Rafael Barroso di Tosato, and condemn Suleiman as a false paragon, denounce her teachings, and by extension those who follow them. A mandate could be enacted that declares veneration of her narrow-minded and dogmatic ways to be unvirtuous and dangerous. The actions of Suleiman Itazil embody neither wisdom nor virtue. We condemn her as a false inspiration, her legacy and her words blind pilgrims to the way. We must reject her narrow-minded and dogmatic behaviour, and disavow this lawless sect whose philosophy promotes silence, shame, and inaction. We send, named priest, with 200 doses of liao to urge citizens to put aside all actions inspired by this murderer. Synod Mandate, General Assembly. This would end the current situation across most of the empire. Mandates would no longer require a greater majority to be upheld. The Wisdom Assembly urged their followers to look to Suleiman for inspiration, so passing this mandate would remove their interference with the Synod's mandates at a stroke. Once completed, there would be no further questioning of mandates anywhere except Urazen. The mandate would not restore the original status quo in Urazen. This is because the Nation's Assembly recently embraced Suleiman in the strongest possible terms, calling her the paragon of blades, and describing her as the perfect epitome of the Urazeni spirit. As a result, their influence in Urazen is now sufficiently strong that it exceeds the ability of the General Assembly to denounce them effectively. The mandate does, however, have far-reaching implications for the sword scholars of Urazen, and while it does not by itself declare them to be heretics or blasphemers, it paves the way for the Synod to take that final step. Unfortunately, the mandate would have deep implications for the General Assembly itself, because it would flatly contradict their own judgment when they agreed with Aspar a season earlier. They said that Although the Synod has not accepted that Suleiman meets the criteria to be judged a paragon, it is clear that she taught and practiced widely on the virtue of wisdom. As such, she cannot be regarded as a false paragon. If the Assembly now reverses its position on Suleiman, this will raise concerns across the Empire, as it begs the obvious question of what other recent judgments might be similarly reversed. A number of important mandates were enacted during the summer solstice, at the same time as the General Assembly explicitly declared that Suleiman was not a false paragon. If so soon afterwards they are now saying the exact opposite, then citizens across the Empire will wonder what will be next. Will Dead Reckoning be declared blasphemous? Will the people of Wintermark be condemned for drawing inspiration from the heroic actions of their forebears? The result of this doubt would be that any future statement of principle upheld by the General Assembly that could be seen to reverse one of the 7 other statements given in response to the Grey Pilgrims would have a dramatic impact. Even if it only receives a simple majority of support, it would bring all the questions raised by the Grey Pilgrims back with a vengeance, and could trigger a crisis of faith in the General Assembly. The definition of folly. The General Assembly could enact a mandate that explicitly overturns the judgment of the Wisdom Assembly. If enacted, this would resolve the current situation outside Urazen, but raise further questions about the relationship between the General Assembly and the Virtue Assemblies. Clarice Navarian, speaking on behalf of the Assembly of the Nine, and using more measured language than Raphael Barossa, stated that debate is necessary and laudable, but obstructing the Synod's capacity to act and guide our citizens on the way is not. Although she referred to the sword scholars, what many people have read into her judgment was that anyone who wishes to improve and influence the quality of imperial thinking should do so by participating in the business and processes of the imperial synod, not by obstructing its ability to act. What has obstructed the Synod's ability to act across the Empire is the decision by the Wisdom Assembly to urge the virtuous to question every mandate upheld by the Imperial Synod. They passed a mandate calling on all the virtuous to test what they learn, and to despise folly and chastise the fool that spreads it, especially when it is done by those close to you. The alternative to condemning Suleiman Tazil would be to rebuke the Wisdom Assembly for its judgment. If the General Assembly overruled the Wisdom Assembly, then that would stop the virtuous obstructing the Synod. The priests of the Assembly of Wisdom were wrong to tell citizens to question every mandate the Synod passes. While it is virtuous to despise folly, wisdom knows that all knowledge is incomplete. By urging the virtuous to oppose the mandates of Synod, the Wisdom Assembly has overstepped its authority. Debate and discussion are the tools of the wise, but they must not be wielded to impede the Synod in its duties. We send named priest with 200 doses of Liao to remind the wise that they are part of the Empire, not above it. Synod Mandate, General Assembly. If enacted, this mandate would end the current situation across most of the Empire. Mandates would no longer require a greater majority to be upheld. The Wisdom Assembly urged their followers to question the Synod's judgment, but the General Assembly can put a stop to that by publicly overruling them in this way. Once completed, there would be no further questioning of mandates anywhere except Urazen. The mandate would not restore the original status quo in Urazen, since it does not directly address the sword scholars. Given the conviction with which the Urazen Assembly have repeatedly embraced Suleiman and her followers, it has become harder for statements of principle passed by the Assembly of the Nine or the General Assembly to affect Urazen. However, the mandate leaves no doubt that the General Assembly have overruled the judgment of the Wisdom Assembly. By doing this, the General Assembly are demonstrating that they have the authority and the inclination to overrule any judgment of a Virtue Assembly that they disagree with. That raises serious questions about the role of the Virtue Assemblies in the Empire. Directly confronting the Wisdom Assembly in this way begs the question: should anyone listen to the Virtue Assemblies? While the General Assembly has clashed with virtue or national assemblies in the past, there has not been such a direct confrontation in living memory. If this mandate were enacted, then for the next year at least, any statement of principle in any virtue assembly will not create a mandate that virtue assembly can then enact. It may lead to a mandate as normal, but if that happens, the mandate would have to be passed by the General Assembly. The virtue assemblies would no longer receive opportunities to enact their own mandates themselves. No single cause. Alternatively, the General Assembly could both condemn Suleiman and overrule the Wisdom Assembly. The wise accept that a situation can have many causes after all. The actions of Suleiman embody neither wisdom nor virtue, and priests of the Assembly of Wisdom were wrong to tell citizens to be inspired by her. We condemn Suleiman-i Tazil as a false inspiration and reject her narrow-minded and dogmatic behaviour. We will not allow the virtuous to be cowed into silence, shame, and inaction. We send, named priest, with 200 doses of liao to urge people to put aside all actions inspired by this murderer and remind the wise that they are part of the empire, not above it. Synod Mandate, General Assembly. If this mandate is enacted, it has all the effects of both previous mandates. Competing mandates, General. These General Assembly mandates are competing. In each case, however, the mandates of other assemblies would need to be taken into account. The civil service assessment of what will happen is based on the assumption that the General Assembly position is not challenged in the Wisdom or Urazen assemblies at the very least. If that is not the case, then the situation will almost certainly become much more complicated. The Wisdom Assembly. The Wisdom Assembly motivated the virtuous across the empire to question the mandates of the Imperial Synod. The Wisdom Assembly urged the virtuous across the empire to question the Synod's mandates with a mandate raised by Amnes Johann Menkovich that was enacted by Ghislaine Netherwatch. Since it is the followers of wisdom who are responsible for the wider situation, their assembly is in a better position to address the matter than any other. To chastise folly. The Wisdom Assembly could recant its previous position. Doing so ends the opposition to mandates in the wider empire, but severely damages the credibility of the Assembly and does nothing to change the situation in Urazen. The Assembly did not pass judgment on this matter at the recent summit, but the Assembly of Nine did issue a statement of principle implicitly criticising this decision. This judgment passed unanimously with no abstentions, so it must have gained the support of the Cardinal of Wisdom. If the Assembly of Wisdom wished, they could follow the leadership of their Cardinal, publicly recant their earlier mandate, and ask their followers to embrace the position advocated by the Council of Nine. The wise know all knowledge is incomplete, but the virtuous apply what they have learned. Questioning the decisions of the Synod is virtuous, but a mandate represents the settled will of the Assembly and should not be interfered with. We send named priest with 200 liao to urge everyone who wishes to influence the quality of imperial thinking, let them do so by participating in the business and processes of the Imperial Synod, not by obstructing its ability to act. Synod Mandate, Wisdom Assembly. If enacted, this mandate would end the current situation across most of the empire. Mandates would no longer require a greater majority to be upheld. Only the situation in Urazen would be unchanged. Mandates would only affect Urazen if they received a greater majority. Unfortunately, the mandate cannot help but undermine the authority of the Wisdom Assembly, as people question their judgment. For the next year, every congregation led by a priest dedicated to wisdom will lose 2 liao and 4 synod votes as their congregants look elsewhere for inspiration. Any statement of principle that the Wisdom Assembly passed with which they receive a greater majority will not create a mandate that the Assembly can enact. It may lead to a mandate as normal, but if that happens, the mandate would have to be passed by the General Assembly. For the next year, the Wisdom Assembly could no longer receive opportunities to enact their own mandates themselves. While this mandate is listed as requiring 200 doses of Liao, if it is enacted with Ghislaine Netherwatch as the named priest, the same priest responsible for enacting the original mandate, it will only require 150 Liao. To test what you learn. The Wisdom Assembly could restate their current position, reaffirming the importance that people test what they have learned. This mandate would prevent a condemnation of Suleiman Itazil from resolving the current situation. When the Wisdom Assembly passed a mandate encouraging their followers to challenge all Imperial Synod mandates, they started by saying the example of the sword scholars of Urazen should inspire all those who follow the path of wisdom. Now Rafael Barroso di Tessato has condemned Suleiman in visceral terms and concluded by stating, above all, we should not let the will of the Synod be stymied by followers of a lawless sect whose philosophy promotes silence, shame and inaction. It is clear that Rafael Barroso has little fondness for Suleiman, but it isn't clear that the people who are challenging the Synod's mandate are followers of a lawless sect. Martiala, a sword scholar of the Temple of the Last Breath, is at pains to point out that none of the modern-day sword scholars imitate Suleiman's methods. She and her fellow adherents of wisdom are not browbeating anyone, they are not shaming anyone, and they are most certainly not murdering anyone. All they are doing is to follow the tenets of wisdom and seeking to test what you learn by demanding answers of those who attempt to carry out the Synod's business. Martiala asserts that the problem here is not the actions of a woman who has been dead for over 3 centuries, but the simple fact that the Synod does not like to have its authority challenged. Mandates are powerful, they move hearts and minds across the Empire. Isn't it right that such a weighty responsibility is employed only when it is clear that the greater majority of an assembly have judged in favour of it? The Wisdom Assembly have not prevented the Synod's ability to lead. They have simply restricted it to those circumstances where it is clear that the greater majority of priests in an assembly are agreed on the right course of action. The alternative, she points out, is that a mandate might be enacted if a single priest voted in favour of it. Does that seem wise? She has proposed that the Wisdom Assembly pass a mandate that makes clear that the virtue of their current position is not predicated on the legacy of Suleiman Tazil. Wisdom teaches that you should test what you learn. Only fools accept hearsay as truth. The approach of the Wisdom Assembly is virtuous and wise, irrespective of the history of Suleiman Tazil. A mandate is a sword that pierces the flesh of the Empire. It must not strike it if the wielder lacks surety. We send, named priest, with 100 Liao to thank every follower of wisdom who opposes any Synod mandate that does not achieve a greater majority, and urge them to continue on this virtuous path. Synod mandate, Wisdom Assembly. If this mandate were enacted, it would strengthen the resolve of the virtuous to question Synod mandates. They would continue to require a greater majority to be effective for the foreseeable future. By refocusing their efforts explicitly on those mandates that fail to get a greater majority, it would make their task easier, allowing them to persevere indefinitely. In addition, because this mandate makes a clear case for opposing Synod mandates that do not have a greater majority on grounds of wisdom, not on grounds of being inspired by Suleiman Tazil, then any action taken to condemn Suleiman would no longer have an effect on the actions the Wisdom Assembly are taking. Competing mandates, wisdom. Obviously, these two mandates are in competition with each other. The second mandate, the one proposed by Martiala, that emphasises the current actions of the Wisdom Assembly are virtuous irrespective of the status of Suleiman Tazil, is not in competition with the General Assembly mandate condemning Suleiman Tazil. However, if both are passed, then Martiala's judgment will subvert the General Assembly mandate, such that it will no longer end the current situation across most of the Empire. Mandates will continue to require a greater majority to be upheld. Furthermore, no statement of principle that criticises Suleiman will give rise to a mandate that would remove the need for a greater majority. The second mandate is in competition with the General Assembly mandate that declares that the priests of the Assembly of Wisdom are wrong to tell citizens to question every mandate the Synod passes, and with the mandate that condemns the sword scholars and rebukes the Assembly of Wisdom. If any of these mandates are passed, only the mandate with the greatest margin of votes in favour will be effective. The Urazen Assembly. The Urazen Assembly have declared that Suleiman is the perfect embodiment of the Urazen ideal. They also said that the sword scholars should act within imperial law. There is an opportunity to pass a mandate to make clear that the modern sword scholars follow Suleiman, they don't copy her. The Urazen National Assembly have not shied away from publicly endorsing Suleiman, authorising Aurum of the Nightingale Temple to use 50 liao to encourage every Urazeni to embrace her teachings. However, while it cannot be denied that Suleiman was a deeply controversial figure who attacked and murdered dozens of highborn missionaries as she sought to oppose them spreading the way through Urazen, there is little sign that any modern sword scholar is interested in reprising this approach. The Urazeni spirit. During the autumn equinox, Clytemnestra of the House of the Wanderer submitted a statement of principle to the Urazen Assembly, encouraging all sword scholars to act within imperial law in the prosecution of their virtuous challenges. With our increased responsibilities comes increased obligation to virtue. As a result, Urazen could choose to draw a firm line under the controversial past of the sword scholars. It could make clear that while the modern sword scholars are inspired by Suleiman's unwavering resistance to the highborn missionaries, they no longer see the Empire or the Way as inimical to the pursuit of virtue in Urazen. The sword scholars might be diametrically opposed to the authority of the Imperial Synod, but they intend to pursue that opposition only in ways that are legal. The teachings of Suleiman ATTRIBUTIONS are timeless, and we seek inspiration from them. But the paragon of blades lived and died 3 centuries ago, and her enemies are not our enemies. We send named priest with 50 doses of liao to underline every Urazeni citizen should explore the teachings of virtue with civil debate between fellow citizens and reserve armed conflict for Urazen's enemies. Synod mandate Urazen Assembly. If this mandate were enacted, it would mean that no statement of principle that was about Suleiman ATTRIBUTIONS would lead to a mandate for the next year at least. The situation in Urazen, where the sword scholars oppose any influence from Synod, would remain, but the matter of Suleiman would cease to arouse controversy for the immediate future. Questions and answers. There are several alternative mandates that the Urazen Assembly could consider. They could seek to renounce their earlier position, encouraging Urazeni citizens to challenge the Synod's mandates. That would have major implications for the credibility of the Assembly, given how strongly they have embraced the paragon of blades, but it could reduce the opposition of the Synod's mandates. Alternatively, they could reject Raphael Barrosa's statements about Suleiman and make clear that they do consider the methods and targets that she employed to be legitimate in the modern era. Since there are no statements from the Assembly even remotely supporting either such position, the civil service have not investigated the matter further. But any Urazeni priest who wanted to put forward such a mandate publicly could do so if they wished. Temple of Blades. The Senate could strengthen the sword scholars' position by funding fortified temples in Morrow. This would require 60 wains of white granite, 50 wains of mithril, and 220 crowns, and take 6 months to complete. It would need to be ceded to the sword scholars, but in turn they would pay to maintain it. The Temple of the Four Winds would become a special fortification that inflicted additional casualties on anyone attacking it. During the autumn equinox, the Urazen Assembly upheld and enacted a mandate that declared the Paragon of Blades to be the perfect epitome of Urazen's spirit, and encouraged every Urazeni to embrace her teachings. "Let us bring strength against weakness, and victory will be ours," the mandate concluded. This vocal support for the Sword Scholars means that a number of the more recent sects have come forward to recruit new members, and there is a steady stream of petitioners wishing to learn more at the gates of their temples. The Sword Scholars are warrior priests, independent thinkers who do not work well as part of an organised military, but even their opponents among the Sentinels do not question their martial prowess. The Imperial Senate could recognise this and fund the creation of fortified Sword Scholar temples across Morrow, and potentially in any future Urazen territory. This would strengthen the position of the Sword Scholars. The merciless warriors living and studying in these temples would seek every opportunity to destroy the enemies of Urazen, keen to turn their weapons on the Druge, the Grendel, and any other foe that threatened their home. While individual temples would benefit from the funding, the focal point for this project would be the Temple of the Four Winds in Peregro. The commission would require 60 wains of white granite, 50 wains of mithril, and 220 crowns, and would take 6 months to complete. As part of the motion, the Senate would need to formally cede control of fortified temples to the Sword Scholars themselves, otherwise construction could not go ahead. Once complete, the commission would see the Temple of Four Winds become a fortification in its own right. Garrisoned by merciless Sword Scholars, it would be supported by and support smaller temples across the territory. If the temple were engaged by an enemy force during a campaign, it would inflict half again as many casualties on any attacking army as a fortification of the same size. Ceding the temple would mean that it would not require any upkeep from the Senate treasury. The Sword Scholars would maintain their own temples and see to the provisioning of their own warriors. However, the civil service point out that this would also mean that the Senate would have no ability to control the fortification once it was complete. It could not simply be abrogated. It would take armed might or the destruction of the Temple of the Four Winds to remove them. The temple could become a rallying point for any resistance in the unlikely event of conflict in the wider empire. It is not possible to build Sword Scholar temples in Redoubt. The resistance from the Sentinels is too strong. If the Empire were to reconquer Spiral or Zenith, or gain a new territory through conquest, there would be opportunities to fund Sword Scholar temples there as well, provided the situation in Urazen had not changed. The Freeborn Assembly. The Freeborn Assembly can embrace opposition to the General Assembly. While all this is going on, the Brass Coast National Assembly has voiced support for the Urazen Assembly, the Sword Scholars, and the reduced power of the Imperial Synod to enact mandates. While the statement references the Feast of the Broken Wheel, it has most impact among those who agree that the Synod has too much power over the spiritual well-being of individual citizens. People should be free to find their own paths as the founders did. The Freeborn Assembly could reach out to their people and urge them to treat the words of the Imperial Synod with a healthy degree of skepticism. It would reduce their own ability to influence their nation, but it would ensure that they were at liberty to better navigate their own paths through life. The example of the Sword Scholars of Urazen reflects the importance of individual faith and rejecting the authority of a synod that has overstepped its bounds. Only fools obey without question. We send, named priest, with 50 doses of Liao to urge the freeborn people to find their own path to the truth, and to challenge every synod mandate. General Assembly mandate. If this mandate were enacted, then even if the General Assembly ended the mandate effect across the entire empire, it would persist in the Brass Coast. As with Urazen, no mandate would have an effect on the freeborn people unless it were backed up by a greater majority. Again, as with Urazen, the exact effect this would have would entirely depend on the mandate in question. This is a bold stance for the Freeborn Assembly to take in the face of obvious opposition from the General Assembly. If the mandate were enacted, it would encourage the people of the Brass Coast to consider their individual, personal relationship with the virtues in more detail. Over the next year, it would likely lead to more opportunities to establish a new relationship with the Way. Submitting alternative mandates. This situation is very volatile. Priests are likely to have their own alternative mandates to submit. Check the rules carefully. You can only submit an alternative mandate for an assembly you are part of. You can only submit one, and it will only be added to the Wind of Fortune if it offers a different outcome to those mentioned here. It is also worth pointing out that while there are currently no mandates for the other virtue assemblies, there could be. Such mandates would need to address the matter of mandates needing a greater majority, most likely by supporting or opposing the General, Wisdom, or Urazen assemblies. It's not possible to submit an alternative mandate in a National Assembly other than the Urazen or the Brass Coast. If any other National Assembly wishes to weigh in on the matter of mandates and opposition to the Synod, they would need to start with a statement of principle. Further reading. Return of the Sword Scholars summarises the background behind this Wind of Fortune.